All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another ePrime live stream. My name is Devon Struthers, and I'll be your presenter for today. So today's topic is actually kind of a cool one. Today's topic is common ePrime error messages and how to solve them, or common ePrime errors. So today's going to focus on kind of a broad topic of errors that we in technical support kind of see pretty frequently, and just how to get around them. So it'll cover everything from ePrime licensing. If you have experienced any licensing errors, experiment design errors, I'm going to go into some scripting errors as well, and then I'm going to finish with a couple of port communication errors as well. So the first one I want to start off with is something that some of our users seem to be pretty familiar with. I'm going to go ahead and try to open ePrime 2.0, and I'm going to show you one of the error messages that come up right away. So whenever you go to click on an ePrime program, I'm clicking ePrime 2 right now just because my ePrime 3 is licensed. It does this operation here when it says ePrime is initializing. Now what it's actually doing behind the scenes is it's actually checking for licensing. It's checking a couple of things. First, it's checking your serial number that you entered whenever you installed ePrime. But second, it's checking for a presence of a hardware key. And for some of you, this might seem pretty familiar, this error message here. It says system in violation of the license agreement. It says to avoid seeing this message, attach appropriate hardware key. And then if you have never attached a hardware key to the computer, you're going to get this error message here. It says grace period is not available until your ePrime 3 ePrime license is fully validated. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK to this error message and open up eStudio. And if you take a look, it's going to look pretty blank. I can't really do anything. I can run an experiment if I have one, but I don't have an experiment loaded into it here. And this is kind of the end of the line, unfortunately. Now what this means is that you need to attach a hardware key to ePrime. Now, I have an example of an ePrime 2 hardware key right here. Just looks like this little green USB key. I even have the word Pro written on it just so I know that it's a professional hardware key, which might be something good for you to do. But to solve this error message, all you have to do is actually take this hardware key and just plug it into the computer. This is probably one of the most frequent error messages that we get and probably one of the easiest solved. We do have an excellent knowledge base article on this one as well that includes some troubleshooting steps. I'll show you guys that one very quickly. But it also shows you some troubleshooting steps that might happen if you take your hardware key, plug it into the computer, and it's still not working. So if I just go to our support site, which is support.pstnet.com, all I need to do to kind of work through this error message is just type in the name of the error message. So violation of license agreement, and the first thing that I should see is user receives system is in violation of license agreement when opening eStudio. And if you look here, these are the steps that you should take. So first one is there an antivirus program running in the background? Now that's something I really need to check, and the reason that I'm checking this is because whenever ePrime looks for this hardware key, it's actually connected to a port called localhost 1947, and if for whatever reason, my antivirus program's blocking that port, which is pretty common because there are some hackers that like to try to sneak in your computer through that port. If for whatever reason that's being blocked by your antivirus program, it's not going to be able to see that the hardware key is attached. It also wants you to make sure that that there's some other things. So is there a printer connected? If there is, maybe that's one of the problems. Those kinds of things. The other thing that we do recommend as well is going on to Sentinel support site. And if we go into Sentinel support site, you'll see that there are a lot of different drivers for these hardware keys that are available. Downloading the latest driver from Sentinel support site is also going to help you get around this error message if you do receive it in the future. So that's one of the really great ways to get around that error message. It's probably one of the more frequent ones we see, and it's really, really easy to get around. Mostly it's just, hey, plug in the hardware key, and if you're using a network license, make sure you're able to actually see that network license. So now that we have the licensing one out of the way, I have a couple of experiment design related errors to show you guys. Now the first one is going to be in this experiment that I made here, and it's going to demonstrate using reserved words in ePrime. So what reserved words in ePrime are is they are just a series of words that ePrime uses internally, just for like its eBasic language and stuff like that. So if I take a look here at my experiment, I'm actually going to change this name. So I have three colors here. I have A color, I have B color, and I want to rename this one so it's consistent. Right now it's kind of misspelled and looks kind of weird, and I have A color and B color, so I'm going to rename this one to C color. There we go. So now I have three very neat slide objects on my experiment, one of which is going to show a background of red, one of which is going to show a background of blue, and the third one's going to show a green background. So I'm going to go ahead and try to run this experiment, and I'll show you what I'm going to get here. And I'm just going to run it in windowed mode in e'Prime3 quickly to test. I'll run it 1 times normal speed. So I get this weird error message that says, error found during compile. The following error was found while attempting to compile eBasic script. No default property for the object. Well, that's weird because all my objects look to be the same. So if I take a look at here, you'll notice that this error message actually only appears in the user script. It doesn't show up in an inline object. It doesn't show up as a property of one of these things. And if you ever get an error message like this that shows up just in the user script, it's important to kind of take a look at the context in which you see this error message. So if you look here, line 370 is highlighted. So I'm going to need to focus specifically on line 370 in the future whenever taking a look at some of these things here. So let's go ahead and scroll to the left and see where we are in context. So right now, it says load values from context if they exist. And it says if attrib exists, and then it's looking for this attribute. And if you look here, it's actually looking specifically for something called color. And it says if I don't find color, then throw this error message. So I need to take a look at these objects here to kind of determine where this is coming from. And as I had mentioned earlier, this is kind of an experiment, or this experiment demonstrates what happens when you use a reserved word in e'Prime. And if you look here, one of my reserved words is this C color. Now, C color, whenever you're using it in inline script, is used to cast an object as a color. So if I'm going to take the word red and I want to make it recognizable as a color in e'Prime, I would do C color, and then I would put the word red in color in that C color statement there. But if I'm using it as the name of an inline or of a slide object like this, I'm going to get these strange errors like I am now. So one of the easiest ways around this, and one of the ways that I like to tell people just to avoid this very quickly, is just change the name of the object and just put the word the in front of it. So I'll go ahead and rename this guy. There we go. Just put the C color. And now if I go ahead and try to run that again, my experiment's going to run exactly the way I want it to, including that C color. So this is probably one of the easier workarounds for this, especially if you want to try to keep naming consistent. If I want A color, B color, and C color, you can keep naming consistent like this. I actually chose this example too, specifically because this is something that tripped up not only me, but my entire lab as an undergrad. And this was something that had tripped us up honestly for weeks. And the only reason that we found the solution for this one is because we took a look at this article that we have under our eBasic help. The article is called Reserved Words. So if you go ahead and take a look at that article, it lists a lot of the very commonly named reserved words in e'Prime. And if you name any object, so a slide object, a text display object, feedback display object, anything like that, or if you name an attribute, so in a list object and name an attribute, one of those reserved words, you're going to end up with these very strange errors like this. We also end up seeing this a lot too if users have a list object that has one of our reserved words as an attribute. You might end up seeing these weird partial data files. So the data file might look fragmented. It might look like it's skipping a couple of trials. It might look like you might not have all of the data there that you're expecting. If you see that, we do recommend taking a look through your experiment object and taking a look at some of those reserved words to see if any of the objects or attribute names in your experiment object or in your experiment has any of those reserved words. And like I said, I've seen this pretty frequently in support. These reserved words are pretty easy to stumble upon, especially if you're doing something like this where it's like, oh, A color, B color, naturally the next one would be C color. So they're pretty easy to stumble upon just kind of on your own. So we do recommend consulting that list of possible reserved words in e'Prime just to verify, oh, hey, I'm not using any one of these, or this might be the cause of my error. And it's generally good practice too to just not necessarily common sense, but don't name anything in your experiment the same name as, let's say, an E object. So I shouldn't name anything just slide or just feedback display or just inline or just text display, something like that. And it's also good to not name anything consistent with a property name or a data logging property. So, for example, if I go into my logging tab, I wouldn't want to call anything RT, or I wouldn't want to call anything onset time. I know that those are a little specific, but it's a good example. I wouldn't want to name anything consistent with any property that's already set in ePrime, just to ensure consistency and to ensure that I'm kind of avoiding these reserved word errors here. All right, so I have another fun error to show too. This kind of dovetails into two. So the first one that I'm going to do is this called pixels and percents. So one of our recommendations that seems a little arbitrary until you kind of mess it up and get this error is that we recommend whenever you're moving a slide sub-object or setting the position of an object on the screen, we recommend using percentages of the screen or relative values. If you take a look here, I actually have a text display or a slide text sub-object in the middle of my slide object. It's just called my center text, and I'm going to go into its properties here quick. Now, if you go into the Frame tab, we do recommend setting everything with percentages. So if you look here, my height and width are set to 25%. Those are all completely relative values. But if you look here, my position, my X and Y values are set to pixel values. Now, I know that some experimental paradigms, especially if you look at there are some experiments, are written in terms of pixels. So I have a 500 pixel wide text display object, or this was displayed on the screen at 700 pixels or something like that. These are very good descriptive things for method sections of experimental research, but sometimes when you're using ePrime, they don't necessarily translate well. So I'm going to go ahead and run this experiment with my X and Y position here set to these pixel values, and this text should show up right in the middle of the screen exactly how I want it. So I'm just going to run it. It says my center text. Looks really good. Great. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this window, and I'm going to hop into my experiment object here. Now, if I look at the display device, you'll notice that I have a height and width property set to ePrime2's default, 1024 by 768, pretty good, high def. What I want to do is I want to change it to ePrime2's default. And I think that one was 640 by 480. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK and save those changes. Make sure that they stay there. Yep, so I have my 640 by 480, ePrime2's default resolution. Now I'm going to go ahead and run this one more time, and I'm going to take a look at where that text shows up. Now if you look, my centered text showed up in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Now the reason it did that was specifically because I am setting, and if you look here in the slide object, you'll see that it kind of jumps to the bottom right-hand corner, and that's because I'm setting, there we go, the X and Y value in exact pixels. And if those are exact pixels, the size of the screen is going to change. So before, when it was 1024 by 768, these values here of 500 and 375 were the dead center of the screen, so this was looking perfect. But since I'm changing the size of the screen, or the screen resolution, it changes how many pixels get drawn to the screen, and therefore changes where this object appears in relation to the screen itself. So that's why whenever you're setting the value here, so any of the height and width properties, any of the X and Y coordinates, those types of things, we always recommend using percentages of the screen. And there's also one more that we recommend as well. This kind of dovetails into another common error that we see. And this one, if you take a look here into the devices and go to the display device, there's this property here that says match desktop runtime at resolution. Now, here at PST, we recommend setting that to no. Because what happens if you set this to yes, and if I click apply and OK and go back into here, you're going to see that if I run my experiment now, my text shows up in an entirely different place as well. Now what this is demonstrating is running this experiment on multiple computers with different screen resolutions. So let's say I have my laptop here that I'm displaying this on. I'm setting my screen resolution to the default, or to match my desktop, which is at this point, it is 1600 by 900. So that's a pretty good resolution for me, but I run this experiment, this text looks like it's just off to the side here. And if I go ahead and run this on another computer that's at 1024 by 768, this is going to look like it's in the dead center of the screen. So it kind of makes everything more relative to how it would look on other computers. So for example, if this is supposed to be in the center of the screen, I run it on another computer, it's going to show off just to the left. It might mess up my effect altogether. So that's why we recommend changing that match desktop resolution at runtime property from yes to no. What this then does, and then picking a common screen resolution between all of your computers. So I think 1024 by 760, there we go. There, by 768 is a good common resolution between all the computers, and we're going to run all of them support this. And then if I go ahead and click apply and OK, you can see here that my text is going to be centered, everything's going to look good, and no matter what computer I'm displaying this on, this text display object is going to still be in the center of the screen and be exactly what I want. So not only, is this going to be really good, or is this going to be good because it's in the center of the screen, but it's just going to be nice to keep everything nice and consistent. Now, we do have a really good question. Someone came in and said 1600 by 900. Would you care to explain the best screen resolution for everyone? It was a great question. Thank you very much for asking that. So generally speaking, we recommend keeping the display device here on ePrime 2 or ePrime 3's defaults. Just at 1024 by 768, that's going to cover probably the widest variety or the widest range of monitors that you could possibly display this task on. So that was a really great question. If you guys have any questions about any of these error messages, or if you find that you're experiencing some error messages of your own in the middle of this live stream, please feel free to let me know. I am more than happy to answer any of you guys' questions. All right. So the next one that we have is more of a script-based error here. So I'm actually going to go into my script errors here, and what I'm going to do is kind of simulate a situation that a lot of users find themselves in. Oh, and there's that license violation I was talking about earlier. So I'm going to kind of simulate a situation that a lot of users tend to find themselves in whenever they're making a more complex experiment with a lot of moving parts. So this experiment here is actually going to demonstrate kind of a baseline experiment. So this is just called my experiment here. I'm going to go ahead and open this one up. And if you look here, it's a very basic experiment. I have a fixation, I have a stim display, and I have a feedback object. Now, there's a couple things that I do want, though, and I want to add this script from this process responses template into my experiment as well. So I want my process responses template script to just be in my experiment too. Now, what's going to happen, and one of the easiest ways to do this, is just to take the script that I have in this process responses template, and I can honestly just copy and paste it from one experiment to another. So if I look here, process responses, I kind of open this up. What it's doing, I have some error checking in here, but what it's doing is it's actually making sure that whenever I push something on, so push a button on the keyboard, it's actually going to save all of my responses as separate responses. So I get the individual logging for each button press no matter when they come in. And it's also going to be changing some of the background color of some of the objects on the slide. And that's going to be pretty cool too. So let's say that this script is something that I do want in my experiment. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste it over here. So I'll take my experiment, have it on the left side, have my process responses on the right, and then I'll go ahead and take my process responses inline object, drag it and drop it just after my stim display. So now I'm going to go ahead and click compile here. What compile does is whenever you have an ePrime experiment and click compile, especially with script, it's going to show you any of the syntax errors that you might have in your experiment. So I'm just going to check it for any syntax errors. And the first thing is unknown function string duration not 0. Well, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at this. This is everything that was in that inline object. I just copied it exactly, and it looks like it should go. So this is another common error in ePrime. So one of the reasons that this happened is because this process responses template isn't the only script that's in this sample. So even though I look here and this is the only inline object, it's still saying it can't get everything. One of the more common errors that we see in ePrime is that people don't tend to look at this user script. So if I look in this user script, you can see that I'm actually setting a lot of constants. I'm doing a lot of very important things in the user script that this process responses template relies on. So if you're copying and pasting script from one of our samples, like this one, for example, or if you're copying and pasting script from anyone else's experiment, it's always important to check this user script to make sure that you have all of the user script that you're going to need, or all the script that you're going to need. So all I'm doing here is just opening the user script, and I click Control-C to copy. I'm going to hop into the user script for my experiment and click Control-V to paste. So now, whenever I click Generate, I shouldn't get that error message anymore. So again, just checking for syntax errors. The specific one was string duration not 0. And there we go. Looks like it worked. So now what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to run this because there's going to be a lot of error messages with this, but I am going to demonstrate another one of the common pitfalls when working with script in ePrime, and especially when copying and pasting objects over like this, is not taking a look at exactly what the objects in your experiment are called as opposed to the objects from the pasted experiment. So if I look in here in my process responses template, I'm going to look at this script here that I copied and pasted, or just dragged and dropped between experiments. Right now, it's setting a variable called the response object, and it's setting it to an object named stimulus. And if I look here, there's my stimulus. This is the object to which I am setting things. And I'm going to hop over to my experiment, and if you take a look, my object isn't called stimulus. It's actually called stimDisplay. And one of the common pitfalls of ePrime, or one of the common pitfalls of scripting in ePrime, is that whenever you copy and paste script like this, you don't change the name of objects to match the name of the objects in your experiment. So you'll want to do that to avoid any errors. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change the name of my variable called the response object. I'm just going to call it stimDisplay. There we go. So now I have an object in here called stimDisplay, and that matches the object in my experiment. What was going to happen is I was going to run, and if I were to run this experiment, I would have gotten a warning right here that says that this object isn't, it says that the object doesn't exist. It's, I believe it's this one right here, that if it doesn't exist, then I'm going to throw an error, or that it's going to throw an error message. The other thing that's important when checking, especially if you're doing this kind of script here where it uses this specific inline script, so the do while the response object.input masks is pending. The purpose of this script is that it's kind of running in the background while your object is also running. So this is going to be processing all the responses I make to my stimDisplay object, while it'll be updating and activating everything kind of live while it's running. One of the more common errors here is if I go into my stimDisplay object, I need to make sure that the duration of it is, instead of 3000 like this, it needs to be 0. And I'm also going to make my pre-release 0 as well. This is another one of the more common errors that we see in ePrime, is that when you have this process responses inline object, in this input mask is pending method especially, that the duration of the stimDisplay object is not set to 0. Now what's going to happen if I don't set this to 0 is my stimDisplay object is going to run for 3000 milliseconds, and every response I make to it's going to look like nothing's happening. And that's not actually going to be good. That's going to be exactly the opposite of what I want, and it's going to look pretty bad when I go to run it. So that's why you need to make sure that that stimDisplay object is set to 0. Now, there's another thing that I do want to demonstrate about this as well. What I want to demonstrate in particular is these statements down here. Oh, so we don't have any. So I'll go ahead and make some. So, right here. So these c.setAttrib statements. So if I want to, and we see this pretty frequently, if we want to make a c.setAttrib statement in between an object here. So I'm actually going to go ahead and delete this and just make a very, very simple c.setAttrib statement. So I'm going to do c.setAttrib, and then I'm just going to make a random attribute just called random word. And that random word in this case is just going to be the word Devon. What I'm going to do now is I have my random word here, and I want to display it on this text display object. And I'm just going to make this my random word. So now what I expect to see whenever I run this experiment is I'm going to see my fixation, I'm going to see my stimDisplay, and then because of my setAttrib statement with random word on my text display 1, I'm going to see the word Devon. So I'm going to go ahead and run that and see if that happens. There's my welcome, and all of a sudden I get an error. It says no such attribute random word. Now this is another demonstration of just errors appearing in the full script here, and it's important to just kind of take a look at the context in which the error is the error looks here. So if I look at this part, it says text display 1.text. So this is kind of telling me that I need to look specifically at the text of my text display 1 object to see where the error is happening. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on this, and it says it's happening with random word. But I just set it just beforehand. It says c.setAttrib random word Devon, and text display here says random word, so this should be good. Now, one of the things we need to check in order to make sure this is working properly is a property that was introduced in one of the later versions of ePrime 2.0. If you're using ePrime 2.0, this property is actually set by default, and we do see people with ePrime 2.0 running into this error pretty frequently. If I go into my procedure object here and click on the properties page icon in the upper left-hand corner, and then click on the Common tab, I'm going to take a look at this generate pre-run property, and as you can see here, it says top of procedure. Now what this is actually doing is this is a really good way to save time in your experiment. What ePrime is going to essentially do is load everything at the very top of the trial, so any onset delay values or any delays you might have in your experiment happen before the entire procedure even runs, which is a huge benefit because let's say I want my stim display to show up with the most perfect millisecond accuracy I could ever want. And I don't want any onset delays associated with it. If I do that and I have my stim display here, or have my generate pre-run set to top of procedure, it's going to do that, and my stim display is going to have excellent timing and I'll have very low onset delay. But the one thing that it does impact is any c.setAttrib statements that you might be setting in inline script. So if you look here in our process responses, I am doing a c.setAttrib statement, and ePrime said it couldn't find it because ePrime was trying to load all of the properties on this text display object at the very beginning of the procedure before ePrime even ran into this inline object. So to change this, all I have to do is go to this generate pre-run property and change it to before object run. And click apply and OK, and that's the only change I'm going to make. And I'm going to go ahead and run this one more time, just 4 times speed, so it doesn't go ahead and run forever. But I'm just going to run this one more time. Type any key, and there was Devon. So now it's showing up perfectly. So that's just a very easy solution to a pretty common problem when you're writing script in ePrime. Now, another thing that I want to do, or that I want to point out about this script that I had written, and another common, I'm going to say error, it's not necessarily an error, but we'll think of it more of a faux pas, is not putting comments in your inline script. Now, comments aren't necessarily for you who wrote the script because you wrote it, you know what you're doing. It's more for either you in the future or for anyone else who has to take a look at your experiment later on down the line. We always recommend writing as many comments in your inline script as possible, just describing what the script beneath it does. If you take a look at our process responses template, you can see these green comments here. We actually do this quite a lot in our samples. We make sure that there are these very large comments that are very descriptive and that say a lot about what's going on in the script itself. So I'm going to do that here. So I'm going to say displays a word, a new word on the text display 1 object. There we go. So now I have a comment here that's going to describe what this is going to do. And right now it just says a new word. You can even get specific if you want and say displays the word Devon. So now if someone were to take a look at my script in the future, they'll say, oh, okay, this is exactly what this is doing. I understand this now. And this is something that we definitely recommend doing in ePrime. Now, another thing that we would advise against generally, and it's not necessarily an error, it's kind of along the same lines as a faux pas, is not indenting in ePrime. So if you take a look at our sample here, we actually do a really good job and really try to indent these things properly. And when I say indent, I mean, so for example, this if-then statement. The if part and the end if are very clear, so you can see all the conditional actions that are going to appear whenever the if-then statement is triggered. And we just make sure that everything's inside it. Now, since eBasic since eBasic isn't necessarily an indent-based language, like some other scripting languages are out there, you can technically do this. So you can highlight everything and just unindent everything like this, so everything is on the same line, and this will work exactly the same as when everything was indented. Now, what you lose when you do this is you kind of lose the context of all of the indents. So if I take a look here, I can't really tell where my set-attrib statement or where my if-then statements start. I can't tell where my select case statement starts and ends. I can't tell what these two if-then statements are in reference to. That's because I didn't because these aren't indented correctly. So if I indent everything exactly how it was before, now I can take a look and draw a line to where this end if statement is. So I can draw a line for my end if statement, go ahead and look up here, and oh, that end if statement is in relation to this if statement. So this is the entirety of that if then statement. So that's another reason why indenting in ePrime is so important when you're doing scripting. And it's something that not a lot of people think to do, because honestly you can just get the script working just by taking everything and just doing this to it. It will technically work like this, but it doesn't look good, and it's hard to tell, not only for you, but for anyone that might use your script in the future, exactly what this is doing. All right, now I have one last script error that we see pretty frequently, and it kind of applies to a little bit more than script. It's kind of a larger error. But let's say, for example, that I want to get the duration of my fixation object. One of the ways I get my duration of my fixation object is I can go into my logging tab and I can set my logging to standard, and it'll give me this onset to onset time variable here, and that's going to tell me how long this was on the screen. But let's say I want to fact check ePrime. Let's say I don't necessarily want to trust that it's going to report exactly what it gives me there. Let's say I want to make my own attribute that has the duration of my fixation time there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just I'll make a new variable, dim fixation duration as long. What this is doing is this is actually just going to define a variable as a long, so it knows I can hold numbers. I'll put fixation duration is equal to fixation dot offset time minus fixation dot onset time. So I'm just doing some very simple math here. I am doing the difference between when the object appeared on the screen and when it left the screen. And I'm just going to set it to an attribute. Actually, I'll put it in the debug window here, just so it's easier to see and faster. So I'll put fixation time. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and compile the script just to make sure there aren't any syntax errors before I run it. That all looks good. So I'm going to go ahead and run it quickly. There we go. Just going to run quickly. All right, so let's get out of here and let's go into my debug window. So if I look at my fixation time here, it's not necessarily what I expected, is it? It looks like my fixation was on screen for 0 milliseconds and then 1 millisecond and 0 milliseconds, and that's not entirely accurate because we saw it when it was running. I was running at 4 times its normal speed, but its duration here is set to be 1,000 milliseconds. So the reason that this is happening is because when I'm trying to judge the time of this object, I'm using the fixation.offset time. Now, if I look at the duration input property here, the one that's messing me up in this case is this pre-release property. Now, pre-release right now is set to same as duration, and what this is doing is this is actually telling ePrime that as soon as this object appears on the screen, stop processing it and move on to the next object. That way, ePrime, is able to load the next object with as fast as possible or for as much time as possible. But what I'm losing here is I'm losing the ability to determine exactly when this object is leaving the screen. So what we recommend, instead of doing the dot offset time of an object, we actually recommend using the dot onset time of the object after it. So if I take this inline and move it down, I'm going to put it just after stim display, and I'm going to change this from fixation.offset time to stim display.onset time. Make sure I spelled that right. There we go. So what I'm doing essentially is I'm subtracting the fixation onset time from the stim display onset time. And I'm using the stim display onset time instead of the offset time of the fixation object because the onset time of the stim display is actually when this fixation object disappeared from the screen. So this fixation object, it didn't actually delete itself from the screen or remove itself from the screen until stim display appeared. So I'm going to run this one more time with that little edit made, and I'm going to run this at 4 times normal speed. I'm going to run this one more time with that little edit made, and I'll show you how much of a difference that makes. Here's my fixation. Clearly more than 1 millisecond. So I'm going to go ahead down here and go to my debug window, and now these look exactly like what I expect. Now they look like 998 milliseconds. You can see there's a bit of delay on these. There was less of a delay here. ePrime's kind of simulating these durations anyway because I'm running at 4 times normal speed under erun test mode. So it's not necessarily something that I need to be worried about, that these are vastly different under these conditions. But this is definitely an improvement. So that's exactly why we recommend using the dot onset time as the reference for when the next object disappeared from screen. And that kind of brings us to another point that I wanted to mention as well, that if you're doing something like this, like let's say I have a response contingent series of inline scripts, or a response contingent script, if I have my my pre-release property here set to same as duration, what I'm essentially doing is I'm giving ePrime 1 millisecond at most to let people respond to this object before moving on to my inline object to process that response. So if I go ahead and add a keyboard here, keep my my duration at 1,000 and keep my pre-release as same as duration, and if I were to do, let's say, an if-then statement that says if fixation .rt doesn't equal 0. So if any response was made, then I'll do debug.print. So if I make any response at all to my fixation object, and I'm just going to look on that quickly. So literally anything. I have a keyboard. All I have to do is push a single button whenever it's run, and I am just going to try to respond to my fixation quickly. I'm only going to run like one trial of this. There we go. And I'm just going to try to type. So I tried to type a spacebar whenever that fixation was on. And I'm just going to spam that very quickly. So I'm actually going to exit this right now. There we go. And you can see that in my debug window, my fixation time actually got much worse because I moved it to before my fixation, or before my stim display object. But you'll notice that I wrote all this script for if fixation .rt doesn't equal 0. I've been responding to my fixation object, and it's not saying a response was made. And that's because I have that pre-release value set to same as duration. Now, if I were to set this to 0 and do the exact same thing, it's going to have slightly different behavior. All right, so, and as you can see here in the debug window, I'm actually logging those responses now. It says a response was made. And that's just another way that pre-release you need to be really cognizant of not only the duration of an object, but the pre-release value of the object as well, especially when you're using script in ePrime. We do see this error message quite a lot, that the pre-release on an object is set to same as duration before an inline object. And we actually have an experiment advisor module that warns against this whenever you do it, whenever you have this in inline script, if you turn that advisor module on. So if I go to tools and options here, no, actually, it's in my experiment. We go to Experiment Advisor. One of these little modules here is actually going to warn me that I have an object with pre-release set on an here, pre-release with caution. It's this one right here. So this is actually going to warn me whenever this might happen. So that's one of the things that we kind of look out for in ePrime, but it's definitely one of the more common error messages that we see. All right, so I'm not going to save the changes to that. Now I have another kind of fun experiment to show you guys that demonstrates one of the more common issues that we see in ePrime. And I'll go ahead and open that quick and then discuss it once it's open. But this one's kind of fun. So the focus of this one is specifically on the unreferenced objects in ePrime. So if I take a look at my experiment, this looks pretty similar to my experiment that I just had, minus all the inline script I made. I'm going to start closing out of these windows quick. So if I look down here, I actually have a lot of objects in my unreferenced object section, but I'm not using them in my experiment. They're up here. Everything that I'm using is up here in the session proc. I don't need any of this unreferenced objects. And unreferenced objects is kind of best thought as ePrime's recycle bin, so theoretically I should be good. So I'm going to go ahead and try to run this quickly. Now the first thing I get is a fatal error occurred when generating the initialization script for the following object, feedback display 1. Now if I look here, my feedback display 1's in my unreferenced object section, but it's actually affecting the entirety of the experiment, and it's affecting all of my run. So not only is it in unreferenced object, but it's actually actively being loaded into E prime and to my experiment whenever it's run. That's why we always recommend to delete everything in your unreferenced object section whenever you're making your experiment. So if I have all these objects down here that I'm not using, then I should probably just delete them. But and one of the reasons is because when you go to run the experiment, you're going to get an error like that on the feedback display object. So if I get that error, I'll just show that one more time. It just says an error occurred while in initialization for the script E object named feedback display 1. Go ahead and double click on this object, and what it means is that my feedback display 1 in here doesn't have an input object name on it, but since I'm not using it in my experiment, I can safely click delete. I will destroy it forever, and I'm going to go ahead and run this experiment. See, now what I'm getting is another error message that says file name on image display not set. But I don't have an image display up here. I only have an image display down here in my unreferenced object section. This is, again, the exact same error message, just on a different object, but for the exact same reason. If I look at my image display here, I don't have an image specified. But even though it's in my unreferenced object section, E prime still tries to load this object whenever I'm running my experiment. So my options are to either find a random image and put it in this file name property, or delete everything from my unreferenced object section. And all I did there to delete it was just right click on my unreferenced object section, and there's this option here that says delete all from unreferenced objects. I did that. It'll delete everything that I'm not using down there, and then now I can run my experiment with no errors. And there we go. Now it's gotten this far. I have no error messages, and all I had to do was delete the objects from my unreferenced object section. So again, that's another common thing that we do see in E prime. We do see people kind of ignoring what's in unreferenced objects, and it is important to be cognizant of that, especially when you're, making large experiments like this. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and exit out of here. I'm going to save it now that it's clean, obviously, and then I have one more design error. And I have two different attempts here. I'm going to open up attempt 1. Now, this is something that we see pretty commonly in E prime. One of the general approaches that first-time E prime users take to E prime experiments whenever they're making them is they kind of look at it and they go, oh, it's like PowerPoint. And they kind of treat E prime like it's PowerPoint. Now, functionally, that's not a problem. If I take a look at my experiment here, I'm actually going to get out of my properties window here, close out as many windows as I can. So you can see this experiment looks gigantic. I have a welcome screen here, I have a fixation object, I have a stimulus, I have a feedback display, and if I go ahead and run it, I'm just going to do no response detected, but what you can see is I have a fixation followed by either an X or a Y on the screen. And I mean, I'm not actually responding to any of these things, but that's what you're going to end up seeing is a response to either an X and a Y on the screen. And functionally, that looked fine. It looked like a very simple experiment. But if you look here, it looks really complicated and really complex. Now, there are some people that kind of figure the ends justify the means. They say, okay, I'm going to just structure my experiment this way. It looks fine. It's not going to be a problem. But let's go ahead and open up the data file quickly. Now, if I open up the data file, you're going to see that all of my data is just going to be all on this one line here. And I didn't actually have any of these set to log any variables, or log any data, which is why you're not actually seeing any of the data here. So if I were to just go ahead and on my duration input, for example, I'll change a couple of them to standard logging. So for stim display 1, I'll just do the first 3. So 1, change stim display 2 here to standard as well. And then I'll change my stim display 3 to standard, just to kind of give you an idea of what the shape of the data file is going to be. Oops. There we go. So if I were to go ahead and run this one again, again, it's going to look very similar. I'm just X and Y's. And it's going to look identical to another experiment I'm going to show you soon too, which is kind of the important part of this. There you go. Just going to open up my data file. And this is kind of why we recommend only having or structuring your experiment with that session, block, and trial. Because if you watch any of my past live streams, which I know some of you have, you see that I always kind of start off with a session proc, and then I move on to a block proc, and I move on to a trial proc. That's to avoid this exact error here. If I go ahead and look at my data file, you'll see that it's all on the same line. So if I want my stimulus, let's say onset delay properties for each one of my stimulus objects, I have to do a lot of digging. So 3's all the way over here, 2's over here, 1's over here. What I'd have to do is load this all into Excel and kind of get all of my stim display objects kind of in the same column. And that's really cumbersome. It's really a long process. Now, what you can do instead is structure your experiment the way that we recommend. And I'm going to go ahead and open up my attempt 2, which is the exact same experiment running the exact same series of 10 trials, showing a welcome screen, a fixation, a stimulus object, and a feedback display, but structured the way that we recommend. And, you know, not only is it going to look a lot better when you look at it in eStudio and be easier to kind of edit all of the properties, but it's going to be much better for our data in the long run. So I'm going to go ahead and click on my stimulus object, make sure that I am logging data. I am. So I'm going to go ahead and run this one more time just to show you guys that, you know, it's going to look pretty similar. Here's my welcome screen. As you see, I have my fixation, and then I have my X and Y values. This is, again, going to run for 10 trials, just like my last one was. But if I look here, it looks much nicer. It's much easier to manage. And changing properties is going to be so much easier too. So if you saw, I had to change the logging property on these objects because I had forgotten to do that. So what I had to do is I had to open up one, go to its properties, go to the duration input tab, click standard, get out of it. Go to the next one, go to the duration input tab, go to the duration input tab, click standard, click apply and OK. And I had to do this for each and every one of my objects. Now let's say I had forgotten that exact same thing on my attempt 2 experiment. I run it and I go, oh no, I'm not getting any data. All I have to do is click on one object called stimulus, click on the properties page icon, click on the duration input tab, and change data logging to standard once. I don't have to do it 10 times. I only have to do it one time. So not only does it end up making the design of the experiment look nice, but it makes making any updates at all in the future much, much easier. And then to kind of tie that all together, I'm just going to open up my data file here. So my data file now looks much nicer. So now if I want to look at the onset delay value of my stimulus column, it's all in one row. I can see each trial. I know that my participant ran 10 trials, so they saw 10 words. And I can see all of my data in a single column right here, which is a lot more consistent with how the data analysis packages work. So if you're using SPSS or anything like that, this is a lot more consistent with how you're going to see the data there, as opposed to seeing the data in this kind of long form series of columns here, and you know, oh, I have to find my onset delay there, and then I have to go, and I guess I could technically collapse everything if I want to by .onset delay, but that's a little cumbersome, and you know, it'll hide the rest of my data. Now I can see it all together here. So you know, if you're ever watching some of my webinars and you're like, why does he keep just setting everything up in this session, block, and trial structure when it would work exactly the same if I put it all in the session proc? This is exactly why we recommend that. And it's a pretty, you know, it's a pretty good way to do things. The other thing that this kind of demonstrates too is an error message that we used to see a lot in older versions of ePrime, but does occasionally pop up. And that's if you have a very, very large experiment, ePrime might end up giving this error message specifically called experiment too large to compile. If you run into this, you know how much of a pain it is sometimes. But what that means is that you have just an entire mass of e-objects in your experiment to the point where ePrime literally has run out of memory to load these objects. Now, these are only under the most extreme circumstances, and generally speaking, if you run into this error message, there's something about your experiment that we can improve and make a little bit better. So if you do find that you're running into this error message, please feel free to give us a call and support. Give us a call or, you know, submit a support ticket. Let us see your experiment, and we can definitely recommend ways to kind of streamline it. But you know, that's one of the ways to get around it, is to kind of structure it exactly how I have here. And a lot of it is kind of utilizing the list object a little more smartly, or just utilizing it at all in the case of my sample here. All right, so the last set of errors that I have are pretty easy. They're just about port communication in ePrime and some of the kind of pitfalls people run into when they're doing port communication. Some of them are pretty easy. The first one I'm going to talk about is an error specifically with the parallel port. So I'm going to go ahead and add one to my experiment here. And one of the major errors, the more common errors that we get, is just people saying, hey, I'm sending signals through a parallel port in my ePrime experiment, and my parallel port's not getting it. One of the first things that we always recommend you check in this case is this LPT number. By default, ePrime sets it to 1, but this isn't necessarily what your system is going to have it saved as. Now, what this LPT number is it's actually relating to a value in your computer's device manager. And you can actually get to the device manager in ePrime if you go to Tools and then click on Windows Device Manager here. This is actually going to get you into the device manager. Now, I don't necessarily have a parallel port on here, so I can't show you guys what this is going to look like. But in this listing here, you're going to see, if you have a parallel port on your computer, you're going to see a listing that says ports, COM, and LPT. You would click on the little arrow next to it, and it's going to say LPT followed by a number. That exact number is what you have to fill in to this device here, or this parallel port device here for the LPT property. So if it says LPT3, I change it to LPT3. Click OK, and now my port is set up to send signals. The one thing that's important to keep in mind about ePrime when sending signals to a port is that ePrime doesn't necessarily care what's on the other end of the parallel port. It just says, hey, I see something called LPT1, you told me to send it through here, I'm sending messages. It doesn't care if there's something connected to the other end. It doesn't care if the other end is receiving things. It just knows that it is going to send wherever you tell it to send. Now, a very, very similar message will appear if you're using serial. So instead of the LPT number, if you're using a serial port here, you're going to want to make sure that that COM number changes. That COM number, could be a quite large value, but just know that you'll need to also go into your computer's device manager, find that ports, COM, and LPT listing, and just find the one that you're looking for. So it'll say COM, and let's say it says COM5. You want to send it to COM5 right there. That's probably the most common error message that we see in relation to port communication in ePrime, is just accidentally sending signals to the wrong port. And it's honestly just as easy as clicking on Tools, clicking on that Windows Device Manager, and just double checking the connection that you have there. And I'm going to round this off, this whole live stream today out with one more common error that we see in ePrime, and that's people saying, hey, I'm sending triggers to my external device. The triggers are getting there. I know that I'm using the right numbers, but there's a delay. And I don't like that there's a delay. I want this to happen exactly when I want it to happen. And what we generally see in those instances is we have something like this, where people have a parallel port in their experiment, and then they will just do something like this. Parallel dot, let's say write byte, and then 255 or something like that. So what they're doing is they're actually sending a parallel port signal in an inline object, is kind of the point that I'm making here. They're sending their signal through script. That is how ePrime used to do it, and that was for the longest time our recommended method. Now, what's going to happen here is ePrime's going to run into fixation. It's going to run fixation, no problem. It's going to run to my inline. It's going to send this this signal to my parallel port, and then it's going to go into my stimulus object, and that's when that's going to appear on the screen. And what people generally say is the problem is they want this inline object to send this signal exactly when stimulus appears on the screen. And they're seeing delays. They're seeing maybe 15 millisecond delays between when this signal sent and when ePrime actually recognizes, or when this object appears on the screen in ePrime. The reason that's happening is because the inline object is being sent through an inline. And what happens is ePrime sends the signal through the inline. It then hits the stimulus object's onset delay value. It pauses for however long the stimulus object's onset delay is, and then it shows it on the screen. And if you've ever run into this, you're going to notice that that delay that you have in your experiment is going to be for the exact duration of the onset delay for your stimulus object when you look in its data. And you can find that just by opening up the file. I already have it open. Just by opening up this file here and just looking at that onset delay value. So, if I see 15 millisecond delay in this case, then I'm going to say, oh, it's the onset delay. Now, what we recommend for getting around this is actually not using an inline object at all to send your signals. And I'm going to delete this from unreferenced objects like we learned earlier. but instead of doing that, actually going into this property that we call task events. Now, if I want to accomplish the same thing, I'm going to want to do stimulus.onsetTime in the script. Sorry, I'm going to want parallel port. There we go. And then I will do write byte, custom 255, and data type will be long. So this is doing the exact same thing that my inline object was doing. The only difference, and the most important difference here, is that not only am I sending this through a task event, but I'm not going to have any of that onset delay that I would have before. And the reason I'm not going to have any of that onset delay or any of those delays is because I'm doing this in a task event. And task event actually time locks these properties. So it'll say not only at the stimulus onset time am I going to draw to the screen, but I'm actually going to send out this signal with a 0 millisecond delay. So now I know that everything's going to line up and I'm not going to get any of those timing delays that I would have in the past with that inline object. And that's another one of the more common errors that we see in ePrime, especially with these kind of delays. All right, so that's all the content that I have for today's live stream. If anyone has any questions or would like to see any more common errors in ePrime, we actually have a really good resource for that. If you go to our sports site, or just our regular website, pstnet.com, you'll see some of the topics that I was talking about today, as well as a few more. Go ahead to our products page, go to ePrime, and we have this little tab here called Common Mistakes. If you take a look, some of these that I've talked about are actually here already. So setting objects and sub-objects locations using pixels instead of percentages, talked about that today. Not completely deleting unused objects from not completely deleting unused objects from the unreferenced objects list. Talked about that as well. So a lot of what we've talked about, as well as a couple more, are all on here. So this is definitely worth taking a look at if you haven't yet. And then, of course, please feel free to go to our support site, just so support.pstnet.com. If you have any extra questions, once you're on our support site, there's a little sign-in button in the upper right-hand corner right there. Go ahead and sign in using your email address and username. And if you have any questions at all, click on Submit a Request. We are more than happy to help. Thank you guys very much for attending today's live stream. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have any recommendations for future live streams, you'd like to see a paradigm, or you're running into a particular error and you'd like me to address that, please feel free to leave a comment. I'm always happy to help, and I'm always happy to kind of shape these things how you guys want to see them. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.